Welcome back to another episode of I'm a Software Engineer. What next?
Good morning. Good morning. Good to see you again, James.
Now,
It's been
this
such a long
morning,
time.
it has. Today, I wanted to talk about something that it probably is relevant to some, less relevant to others, and a lot of people can benefit from it. So I guess the premise of it is title chasers. So people chasing title as opposed to perhaps just the work they're doing. What's your gut reaction when someone brings up job title, like early on in a conversation? Perhaps if you're hiring, for engineers, and then they start asking about the job title they're going to get.
Honestly, this never happened where someone's done it early on, and it would be a massive red flag if someone did that to me. Like I'm thinking, because that's just not how I think about work. But if it was to your more general point about this idea of people chasing titles versus builders, building their careers, I stand by what I said. I tend to feel like that sort of title chasing, title inflation is a bit of a red flag. I tend to be a bit allergic to it, and it's interesting. I think there's a little bit of a cultural thing here with me that I noticed moving to the UK. In my 20 years in Australia, I don't think I ever really felt title pressure in the same way that I have felt it in the UK. And again, I don't know whether that's cultural. It's hard to control for the factors. Is there a cultural difference? But what I did notice when I first arrived here, and in the last 10 years, people are a lot more interested in your title than they ever were in Australia. And I found there was a couple of things that happened. In the organization I was in, there was a sort of a priori deference to title, which I wasn't really used to. And outside the organization, you tended to have these communication channels that would only go between people at the same level. Right. So if you're on a project, directors, say, or VPs tended not to send emails below their level to their counterparties. You would always sort of send it to the same peer. And
it does seem very old-fashioned, doesn't it?
Yeah. Look, and a couple of things could be going on here. Maybe I was never senior enough in Australia to get to that level where that was a factor. That's I fully appreciate that could be a thing, but it did feel different. It did feel a little bit different. Now, so that's kind of just a general comment on titles. The second thing I'd say is there's been a massive amount of title inflation, like over the last sort of 5 or 10 years. People with 3 years experience wanting to be called a senior engineer, and people coming out of like the expectations of some people with these ratcheting of titles is it feels a little bit, I don't know, overcooked.
Yes.
In some ways.
I agree.
And again, like we said last time, I don't know who's to blame. I'll ask you a question actually for a change instead of you asking me all the questions. What have you seen with title inflation? Are you getting pressure from candidates? Are you getting pressure from the hiring managers? Are you seeing the industry itself doing it? Like where do you think it's coming from? I mean, like, does it exist and where do you think it's coming from?
Yeah, it does exist. I wouldn't say certainly in the candidates I'm looking for, it's less prevalent, but I do speak to engineers who will sort of frame that they think they're ready for, senior engineer title, or they're very close to a senior engineer title. So that's what they would expect in their next role. And I think there is, out of all of the progressions or steps, the senior engineer is probably one of the most, I don't know, like people want that, they want that senior title. But what I would say is most of the clients I'm working with now, if you came in as a mid-level, a senior, no matter how senior as an engineer, if you were mostly an individual contributor, you'd have the same title. So you'd be either a product engineer or a software engineer. And then obviously your salary, and then there would be some internal banding like a software engineer 1 or software engineer 2. But generally the title it doesn't really matter because it just describes what you're doing. Yes, there's different levels and you get compensated, but the title, it doesn't really matter. And these are companies that have quite flat structures. So I think that's sort of part of what they...
It doesn't matter to the company, or it doesn't matter to the employee?
Both, in a sense. I think the company isn't... Well, they want to make sure that you're obviously compensated for what value you bring. So it's not to say that they're not giving you a senior title because they want to pay you less. That's not true at all, because you would get paid the market value, let's say. But it's not about title. It's not about like hierarchy. So it's pulling the hierarchy out, I guess.
Okay.
So you're not even unless you're quite a big organization. This is the I guess the world I'm in of startups. You may not even have a manager. So as in you would have someone you report to, but you would sit next to them and you would be doing essentially very similar task to the CTO as you as a software engineer. So I think the titles don't really really matter, but I know it matters to people.
There's a couple of different ways to think about this, and I think it's a really interesting topic, and I'm yet to hear like a perfect answer to it, because I've seen a few different things have been done over time. So the classic approach that you would see is just this sort of linear view, right? You come in here and you do this, 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 and this, and your title reflects your seniority in the business as well as your function. Right.
Yep.
So it might say something like senior software engineer. So that tells me that I'm a software engineer and I'm senior. So I'm not junior and I'm, whatever, I'm senior. Okay. Another way to do that. So that's like the base case, if you like, right? Then one way to think about it though is to separate your seniority from your function. Okay. All right. And so you have situations where you might be a engineer, but you might then be deployed as a venture CTO, or you might be deployed as a creative engineer. So you're saying you're sort of in the engineering cohort, but this is my role. So you can have a kind of a functional element to it as well as a seniority element to it, right? I'm a senior engineer and I'm currently operating as a creative engineer on this project or whatever, right? And then where it gets tricky is what I think we're trying to separate people's performance from their role and their seniority. Like I think there's a few dimensions at play here, and different organizations have different ways of doing that. So if you come from the management consulting or financial markets world, they've got a very distinct separation between your title and then your performance. So your title tends to be this kind of ladder, right? And then within each step in that ladder, you've got certain comp outcomes, like minimum and maximum comp outcomes, but there's a big range of what those comp outcomes can be based on your performance. Okay. And then the even more complicated way to think about it, and this some management consulting organizations I've seen, they split this again into performance and potential. So you may have seen this 9-box model idea where you've got how did I perform? Below expectations, at expectations, above expectations, and then what's my potential? I'm on track to make the next level. I'm not on track to make the next level, or I'm either I need to be managed out, or I need to be coddled and protected, and because I'm a superstar. And so it gets really complicated, really, really complicated. And the only thing that's consistent across all of these systems that I've seen is everyone's unhappy all the time about the way they work. Right. I've yet to see a system where everyone goes, you know what, this is the best thing I've ever seen.
And you probably never get to that. So what should you as an engineer that's listening out there, what should they care about and what should they not care about?
Yeah, okay, look, it's a great question. The problem with my instinctual answer to that question is that it neglects the context. So my instinctual answer to that question, which is sort of more about me, says more about me than anything else, is you should care about doing good work and you should care about working with good people, right? And everything else follows, right? The rest of it's just sugar, right, on what's going on. Good people first, good people do good work, everything else follows. But unfortunately, that's a little bit naive in the sense that the rest of the world cares about other things. So I think, look, it really depends what you're trying to do. Where are you in your career? Where are you trying to get to? Are you just starting out and you need to get the sort of ticks on your resume to say you've done these things? Then perhaps the title's important. As you get more senior, I think it becomes less about the line items and the title and more about what you've done. Right, like if you look at someone who comes along and says they're, like say they're founder and they've built a, 10, 50, $100 million business with an exit, right? That says a lot more. That part of it says a lot more than the fact that they may have been CTO or whatever, VP of engineering. Right. So it really, there's a nuance here. It really depends on what you're looking for. I would hope we can elevate the conversation a little bit above title, right? And get, the trick though is that I'm lucky enough, or have been lucky enough to be in a situation where by the time someone gets to me, I can actually have a nuanced conversation with them about it. The much more difficult bit is standing out from the crowd when you're only exchanging resumes. That's where it's much more difficult.
Yeah, I can picture that. Yep.
Yeah, and look, as a sort of secret that is not that secret, the only way to stand out is to have some kind of presence that goes beyond the resume. You and I are doing this now, right? What's the reason we're doing this? It's about communicating how we see the world and how we would like the world to be. And that goes a long way to raising our profile, full disclosure, right? And that goes a long way to raising our profile above the average person at our level who's just doing the average thing that average person does. Right. And so, like coming in, I'd much rather have a look at a GitHub history for an IC with a bunch of contributions to open source and, a bunch of constructive feedback in comments and issues and so on. That says a lot more to me about someone's ability to contribute in a team and be a meaningful member of a team than it says I've been a React programmer for 5 years.
Yep. I must admit,
or as a senior React engineer at such and such.
As a recruiter, I would say that I become a little bit immune to titles because every organization has such a different way of deciding who is a senior or who is a lead or a manager. So I do tend to look for like demonstrated experience over that. But I would love to test the hypothesis of where organizations that are better or have better cultures probably care less about title versus organizations that have, but then it's, I guess it's different with consulting as well, like you touched on, because you also bill people out, don't you? So they go to a client and they work for them, and they want to see that they're getting either a senior or a mid-level or a junior or a creative engineer or whatever. So it is a complex, it really is quite complex, isn't it?
Yeah. The one thing I think is probably worth adding here is that I'm just going to compare Australia, the UK, and the US where I've worked. And what's interesting is that in Australia, there's basically very little career options for you as an IC beyond lead, say, other than being CTO, right? And so that's kind of very narrow, right?
Yep.
Whereas in the UK, it's a bit better. There are organizations, but it's not great, but it's a bit better. There are organizations that will allow you to progress as an IC past that point where you'd Australia, say, right now you have to move into management. But interestingly, in the US, and again, it's the nature of the US, the way the US tech sector is set up, but you can be an IC right up to distinguished engineer, right, or fellow or something like that, right? And they have in the FANGs, not that this is necessarily what everyone should emulate, but you have this idea of a software engineer 7 or software engineer 9 or whatever, right? Which is someone who is, like, people look at in reverence because they've gone through 9 levels of promotion or 10 or whatever the number, whatever it might be, to the point where, okay, this person is a, internationally recognized expert in this particular domain and is compensated as such. And my experience, at least, is that the US is really out on one extreme and Australia's pretty rubbish and the UK is a bit in the middle.
I agree with that. And I think we've spoken about that in the past where engineers kind of might see that the only way they can get promoted, the only way they can earn more money or be seen to be climbing is to go into, say, a management role, but maybe that's not the right role for them.
It's really unfortunate because typically it's the only way to get a pay rise. And unfortunately, the sort of Venn diagram, let's say, of individual contributor, so engineering, individual contributor, management, and I'm going to add leadership in here as well, right? So the people that are great engineers and the people that are great managers, the intersection of those two sets isn't huge.
Yep.
Okay. Now, some people make the transition from IC to manager and then from manager to leader, and they can do that well enough. But the set of people that are good at both and are exceptional at both is actually pretty limited.
I can see that.
Yeah. And so people get pushed into management, unfortunately, because that's the only way to get a promotion. Like I said, unfortunately, that sometimes has catastrophic consequences because the rubbish manager is the quickest way to toxicity that you'll find. That's
interesting. I think we touched on it with the Carlton's episode where we talked about how it's like a career change going into to being a manager, and perhaps it's not what we need. Or what that engineer needs.
Carlton's exceptional. Carlton went up and back a couple of times, right? And I think it's a highly unusual career path, but it's a testament to his character. He's the kind of guy actually was at the intersection of those two domains, a fantastic engineer and a fantastic manager. And if he wasn't that wouldn't have been possible for him to do that.
Yeah, from memory, I think it was about influence. He felt like he couldn't influence as an IC, so therefore had to go further. But I guess if you love engineering, you'll always miss it if you're not doing it. But I guess there's other ways to have impact, isn't there?
Yeah, well, you can do what I do, right? Which is spend 10 years being reasonably senior in a management leadership roles and then throw it all in and start writing code again and staying up late at night.
Do you miss coding when you weren't coding?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of it's a bit of a pathology on one level because you can get sucked into it and you can feel you can be sort of locally effective, but you're not globally effective. You know what I mean? Like it's a local maximum. So I can be
Mm.
very effective at me just churning out large amounts of code. But if I stand back, I'd be better with three other people and me making sure they were doing their best. That would actually be more effective. So
Yeah.
it's like I said, it's a bit of a pathology. I really love it because it's like making stuff, even though it's conceptual and virtual and so on. But it is making stuff, and you feel like something creative is coming out of your hands. So you feel like you're doing something. Whereas sometimes management and leadership, not you don't quite
Mm.
get the same creative nourishment from it. Yeah, but I'm not making any money at the moment, but I'm loving the fact that I'm writing large amounts of code. It's been brilliant.
Yeah. Thank you for your input again, as always, Matt. We
Thanks, James.
will hope to come back with some more interesting topics. If anyone's got any topics they want to add, please send us a message and we can try and cover it next time.
Mhm.
But yeah,
Yep.
thank you for tuning in if you got this far.
Thanks a lot, folks. Talk to you soon.